the streets of Riverwood shimmered under a blanket of freshly fallen snow, each storefront adorned with twinkling lights and wreaths tied with crimson boughs. Despite the festive cheer that seemed to embrace the town, Sarah Benson hurried down the sidewalk with her hands stuffed deep into her pockets, her scarf pulled snugly against the chill. Christmas was Sarah's favorite time of year, but this season felt different. 3 months ago, she'd lost her job at the small bakery where she'd worked since high school. Her savings had dwindled quickly, forcing her to sell beloved belongings and skip her own holiday traditions. Yet, as her struggles grew, so did her resolve to find purpose. The Riverwood Community Shelter stood at the end of the block, a modest building with a weathered sign and peeling paint. Despite its humble appearance, the shelter had a warmth that drew people in. Sarah paused at the door, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The scent of cinnamon and roasting turkey enveloped her immediately, and the sound of cheerful chatter filled the air. Volunteers moved purposefully around the room, hanging paper snowflakes and setting up rows of folding tables. Sarah. There you are, called Linda, the shelter's coordinator. A plump woman with rosy cheeks and boundless energy, Linda bustled over and handed Sarah an apron. You ready to get to work? Absolutely, Sarah said with a smile, slipping the apron over her head. Linda led her into the kitchen, where a handful of volunteers were chopping vegetables, peeling potatoes, and kneading dough. Sarah was paired with Javier, a retired mechanic whose booming laugh made the cramped kitchen feel twice as lively, and Clara, a college student who was valiantly battling her first onion. We're aiming for a feast tonight, Linda said. There's no such thing as too much food on Christmas Eve. Sarah rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She found comfort in the familiar rhythm of cooking, the hiss of sautéing onions, the rhythmic chop of her knife, the warm steam rising from a bubbling pot of stew. As they worked, Javier filled the room with stories of his misadventures in holiday cooking, including the time his dog had made off with an entire turkey. Clara laughed so hard she nearly dropped a bowl of mashed potatoes. Soon, trays of roasted chicken, creamy casseroles, and fresh rolls were ready to be carried into the dining hall. The guests had begun to arrive, families bundled in mismatched coats, elderly men and women whose faces showed the wear of hard years, and children clutching their parents' hands. Sarah stood behind the serving line, ladling stew into bowls and offering warm smiles to each person. She met Rosa, a single mother who had walked to the shelter with her 2 young daughters. She spoke with Tom, a veteran who shared a memory of a Christmas spent overseas. Each interaction filled Sarah's heart with a deeper sense of connection. When the last plate was served, Sarah joined Javier and Clara at a table, their own meals in front of them. Around them, the dining hall buzzed with laughter and conversation, a community brought together by shared warmth and hope. As Sarah looked around the room, she realized how much the evening meant not just to the guests but to her. In giving, she had found a piece of herself she hadn't known was missing. And though she couldn't explain it yet, something about the shelter felt like the beginning of a story she hadn't expected to write. The next morning, a pale winter sun peeked through gray clouds as Sarah made her way back to the Riverwood Community Shelter. The streets were quieter than usual, muffled by a fresh layer of snow. Though her breath puffed in front of her in clouds, she felt a warmth inside that made the cold easier to bear. When she opened the shelter door, the comforting hum of activity greeted her. Volunteers bustled about, sorting donations and tidying the dining hall. Linda was perched behind a desk in the corner, her glasses slipping down her nose as she scribbled notes on a clipboard. Back so soon, Linda teased, looking up with a smile. I couldn't stay away, Sarah admitted, unwrapping her scarf. Linda handed her a clipboard. We're putting together care packages this morning. Socks, blankets, toiletries, small toys for the kids, you name it. Think you can handle it? I'm on it, Sarah replied, heading to the donation area. There she joined Javier and Rosa, who were sorting through piles of donated items. Rosa's daughters sat nearby, giggling as they played a game of tic-tac-toe in the corner. Sarah fell into step with the others, her hands deftly organizing the items into neatly packed bags. As they worked, Rosa shared bits of her story. She spoke of nights spent worrying about how to keep her daughters warm, of the shame she'd felt walking into the shelter for the first time. But she also spoke of hope, how the shelter had given her a sense of dignity and the strength to move forward. Sarah listened, moved by Rosa's resilience. "You're amazing, she said softly. "Your girls are lucky to have you." Rosa smiled, her eyes misting. "Thank you, Sarah. It's not easy, but being here, it helps. People like you make it easier to keep going." As the care packages were finished and stacked by the door, Linda reappeared with a clipboard and a new assignment. "Lunch prep time," she announced. In the kitchen, Sarah found herself working alongside David, the quiet man she'd met briefly the night before. He was dicing carrots with a focus that bordered on intense, though his movements were slightly awkward, as if he hadn't held a knife in years. "Looks like you're a pro already," Sarah said with a teasing smile as she sat up beside him. David chuckled, a little self-conscious. "Not quite. But I'm trying to be useful." "You're more than useful," Sarah said warmly. "You're part of the team now." David relaxed a little, and as they worked he began to open up. He told her about his life before the shelter, how he'd worked as a construction foreman until an accident left him unable to do the physically demanding labor. Without work, his savings had quickly evaporated, and he'd been living in his car before finding the shelter. "It's been hard," David admitted, his voice quiet. "But places like this remind you you're not alone." "You're not," Sarah said firmly. "You belong here, just like everyone else." As the kitchen filled with the aromas of simmering soup and baking bread, Sarah and David fell into an easy rhythm, their conversation lightening as they traded stories and jokes. When lunch was ready, they carried the trays into the dining hall together. Families and individuals gathered, their faces lighting up as steaming bowls of soup and plates of fresh bread were placed in front of them. Sarah stayed to eat with the guests, bouncing from table to chat with people she was starting to know by name. There was Tom, who proudly showed her a photograph of his grandchildren, and Lily, a quiet teenager who spoke shyly about her love for art. The afternoon flew by in a blur of cleaning, organizing, and planning for the next day. By the time Sarah finally slipped on her coat to leave, the sun was setting in a wash of orange and pink across the snow-covered rooftops. As she walked home, her heart felt full. The shelter had already become a cornerstone in her life, a place where she felt not just useful but connected. It was only the beginning, but Sarah knew she'd found something special, a sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing for far too long. The days leading up to New Year's Eve were a whirlwind of activity at the Riverwood Community Shelter. The staff and volunteers worked tirelessly to prepare for the upcoming winter warmth drive, an event that would distribute coats, gloves, and other cold weather essentials to families in need. Sarah had become a familiar face among the volunteers, and her role in the kitchen quickly expanded. She organized meal prep, helped plan menus, and even taught Clara how to make basic soups. The once overwhelming hum of the shelter had turned into a comforting rhythm, and Sarah felt like she belonged. One chilly morning, Sarah arrived to find David setting up tables in the dining hall. He waved as she walked in, his breath visible in the frosty air. "Good timing," he called. "I was just about to start sorting the coat donations. Care to join me?" "Absolutely," Sarah said, shedding her coat and scarf. They worked side by side, organizing jackets by size and matching them with gloves and hats. As they worked, they chatted about everything from the changing weather to their favorite childhood holidays. "I used to love building snow forts with my brothers," David said, a rare smile softening his face. "We'd spend hours outside until we couldn't feel our fingers, then come inside to my mom's hot cocoa." Sarah laughed. "We didn't have snow forts, but my dad used to make the best Christmas cookies. I've been trying to recreate his recipe for years, but I can never get it quite right." David tilted his head, a playful glint in his eyes. "Maybe you just need a second opinion. A taste tester." "You're on," Sarah replied with a grin. By midday, the dining hall was buzzing with guests picking up coats and gloves. Sarah found herself chatting with Rosa, who was thrilled to have found a warm winter jacket for her youngest daughter. "Sarah, you're like a miracle worker around here," Rosa said, her gratitude shining through. Sarah shook her head, her cheeks flushing. "I'm just helping where I can. It's everyone here who makes this place special." As the day wound down, Sarah returned to the kitchen to help prepare dinner. She worked alongside Javier and Clara, who were debating the best way to make garlic bread. The air was filled with laughter and the scent of roasting vegetables. David popped in, leaning against the doorway. "Smells good in here. Need an extra set of hands." "Always," Sarah said, handing him an apron. Together, the group prepared a simple but hearty meal: beef stew, roasted potatoes, and garlic bread. When the food was ready, they served it to the guests, each plate met with smiles and heartfelt thanks. After dinner, Sarah joined a group of volunteers cleaning up. David stayed behind, wiping down tables and stacking chairs. By the time the dining hall was quiet again, only a few stragglers remained, chatting softly over cups of coffee. As Sarah reached for her coat, Linda approached her with an envelope in hand. "This came for you," Linda said, her expression curious. "For me?" Sarah asked, puzzled. Linda nodded. "It was dropped off by a man earlier. Said he'd been here a few nights ago." Sarah opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a folded note written in neat, elegant handwriting. "Dear Sarah, oh PR, your work at the shelter has not gone unnoticed. You have a gift for bringing people together, for creating warmth and hope where it's needed most. I'd like to meet with you to discuss how we might support your efforts. Please join me for coffee tomorrow morning at Jasper's Cafe, 10 a.m. Sincerely, Edward H." Sarah's brow furrowed as she read the note again. Edward? She didn't recognize the name, but the message stirred her curiosity. "Who's it from?" David asked, noticing her distracted look. "I'm not sure," Sarah said, holding up the note. "Someone named Edward. He wants to meet tomorrow to talk about the shelter." David raised an eyebrow. "Sounds intriguing. Are you going to go?" Sarah hesitated. The idea of meeting a stranger felt daunting, but something about the note sparked hope. "I think I will," she said finally. "I'm curious to see what he has to say." David smiled, his expression encouraging. "If anyone deserves recognition for what they've done here, it's you." The next morning, as Sarah walked to the cafe, her nerves buzzed with anticipation. She didn't know who Edward was or what he wanted, but something told her this meeting could change everything. Jasper's Cafe was a cozy haven nestled on the corner of Riverwood's town square. Its windows fogged from the warmth inside, offering glimpses of patrons sipping coffee and chatting over pastries. As Sarah stepped through the door, a bell chimed softly, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee greeted her. Scanning the room, she spotted Edward almost immediately. He was seated at a corner table, his tailored coat draped neatly over the back of his chair. He looked as composed as she remembered from their brief encounter at the shelter, a man out of place among the chipped mugs and rustic decor, yet somehow completely at ease. "Sarah," he said warmly, standing to greet her as she approached. "Thank you for meeting me." "Of course," she replied, shaking his hand. "I was curious about your note." Edward gestured for her to sit, his expression earnest. "I'll get straight to the point. I run a foundation called Hearts United. We focus on supporting community efforts that make a tangible difference in people's lives. And after seeing your work at the shelter, I believe you're exactly the kind of leader we're looking for." Sarah blinked, startled. "Leader? I'm just a volunteer." Edward smiled. "You're far more than that. In my visits to shelters across the region, I've rarely seen someone with your ability to connect with people, to inspire hope. You have a way of making others feel seen, and that's a quality no title or degree can teach." Sarah's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her coffee. I appreciate that, but I don't see how I could help your foundation. I've been doing this work for such a short time. Edward reached into a leather portfolio and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. This isn't about experience. It's about heart. I'm offering you the chance to lead a new initiative to expand the Riverwood Community Shelter's programs. We want to provide funding for renovations, hire additional staff, and create resources like job training, childcare, and long-term housing support. And we want you to oversee it. Sarah stared at him, her mind racing. Me? Oversee all of that? I wouldn't even know where to start. Edward's tone remained steady and encouraging. You wouldn't be doing it alone. Our foundation will provide funding and guidance. You'll have the shelter's support, and I'll personally ensure you have the resources you need. What matters most is your vision. The people in that shelter trust you, Sarah. You've already proven you're capable of leading. The words swirled in Sarah's mind. The offer was extraordinary, but so was the weight of it. She thought about the people at the shelter, Rosa and her daughters, Tom, David, and all the others who had become a part of her life. Could she really take on something this big? Edward seemed to sense her hesitation. Take your time to think about it, he said gently. Talk to Linda and the others. This is about building something together, something that will last far beyond any one of us. Sarah left the cafe with the folder tucked under her arm and her thoughts a whirlwind of possibilities. At the shelter later that day, she shared Edward's proposal with Linda and a few of the volunteers. Their reactions were immediate and unanimous. Sarah, this is incredible, Linda said, her eyes shining with excitement. Do you know what this could mean for the shelter? For all the people who come here? Javier nodded, his grin wide. You've got to say yes. If anyone can make this happen, it's you. Even David, typically cautious and measured, was encouraging. You've already been doing the hard part, showing up, connecting with people, making a difference. This is just a bigger way to do what you're already doing. Despite their enthusiasm, Sarah still wrestled with doubt. That evening, as she and David cleaned up the dining hall together, she finally voiced her fears. What if I mess this up? What if I let everyone down? David set down the chairs he was stacking and looked at her, his expression steady. You're not going to mess it up. And even if things don't go perfectly, you'll still have made a difference. You're not doing this alone, Sarah. We're all in this together. His words settled over her like a balm, easing the tension in her chest. The next morning, Sarah called Edward. I've thought about your offer, she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. I want to do it. Let's build something together. In the weeks that followed, the shelter underwent a transformation. Edward's foundation provided the funds to repair the building, replace outdated equipment, and launch new programs. Sarah threw herself into the work, collaborating with volunteers and guests to ensure the changes reflected the community's needs. The first initiative, a weekly cooking class, was an immediate success. Sarah taught families how to prepare affordable, nutritious meals, and the classes became a gathering point for laughter and connection. Watching Rosa's daughters proudly roll out dough for homemade bread made every late night and early morning worth it. The shelter became more than a place for meals and warmth. It became a hub of opportunity and dignity, where people rediscovered their strength and potential. One snowy evening, as Sarah and David walked home together, she paused outside the shelter, looking back at the glow of its windows. This place isn't just a shelter anymore, she said softly. It's hope. David smiled. That's because of you. Sarah shook her head, her gaze lingering on the building. It's because of all of us. We made this happen together. And as the snow fell gently around them, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning of something extraordinary, a place where lives could change, one act of kindness at a time. By mid-February, the Riverwood Community Shelter was thriving in ways Sarah had never dreamed possible. New programs were underway, The renovations had transformed the space into a beacon of hope, and the community's involvement had grown stronger with each passing week. Sarah poured herself into her work, balancing leadership with her love for connecting directly with people. She still found time to teach cooking classes, sit down for meals with guests, and listen to their stories. It was the personal connections that reminded her why she had taken on this role. One afternoon, Edward stopped by the shelter unannounced. His sharp suit and polished demeanor made him stand out among the flurry of volunteers sorting donations, but his easy smile put everyone at ease. "Edward," Sarah said, surprised but pleased to see him. "What brings you here?" "I wanted to check in," Edward said, his voice warm. "But more importantly, I wanted to thank you in person. Do you have a moment to talk?" "Of course," Sarah replied, leading him to a quieter corner of the dining hall. Edward gestured around the room. "This is incredible, Sarah. The energy, the people, the impact, it's everything I hoped for when we first discussed this project and more. You've done extraordinary work here." Sarah smiled, a hint of bashfulness in her expression. "I didn't do it alone. The volunteers, the community, and the guests, they're the heart of this place." Edward shook his head, his expression earnest. "True, but every great effort needs a leader. Someone who inspires others, who sees the potential even when things seem impossible. That's been you, Sarah." Before she could respond, Edward reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out an envelope. He handed it to her with a steady gaze. "What's this?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowing as she opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000, made out to her name. "It's a small token of my gratitude," Edward said. "Not just from me but from the foundation. You've gone above and beyond, often putting the needs of others before your own. This is to help you, whether it's for bills, savings, or something for yourself. You deserve it." Sarah stared at the check, her emotions a whirlwind of surprise, gratitude, and disbelief. "Edward, this is... I don't know what to say. I can't possibly accept this." "You can. And you should," Edward said gently. "Think of it as an investment, not just in the work you're doing, but in you. Because people like you make all the difference." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she looked back at Edward. "Thank you. This means more than I can say." He smiled and stood. "You've earned it. And if you ever need anything else, resources, advice, or just a cup of coffee, you know where to find me." As Edward left, Sarah clutched the check in her hands, still overwhelmed by his generosity. She thought about how far she had come since that cold December day when she first walked into the shelter. Later that evening, as the volunteers gathered to clean up after dinner, Sarah shared the news with Linda, David, and Xavier. "Edward gave you that," Linda said, her eyes wide. "Well, if anyone deserves it, it's you." "You're going to use some of it for yourself, right?" David added, his voice gentle but firm. "No more skipping meals or patching up that old coat of yours." Sarah laughed, her cheeks flushing. "I'll use it wisely, I promise. But honestly, just being here, seeing what we've built together, is the greatest reward." The next day, Sarah treated herself to a warm, sturdy winter coat and donated a portion of the money to the shelter's emergency fund. The rest, she decided, would go toward building her future, a future she could now see with clarity and hope. As the weeks turned into months, the shelter continued to thrive, a symbol of what could be achieved when kindness and determination came together. And while Sarah remained at the heart of it, she never forgot the lessons she'd learned along the way, that even the smallest acts of compassion could create ripples of change. And that sometimes, when you gave freely, the universe found a way to give back. For Sarah, the Riverwood Community Shelter wasn't just a place of giving, it was a home, a purpose, and a reminder of the power of hope. And in her heart, she knew the best was still to come.